Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 16. Above all, here it's going through this whole armor of God that we should put on to be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. To strong in the Lord, and that's what this most important preventative medicine gets down to, is being strong in the Lord, in God's power, as opposed to all the other stuff. Not that some of that physical stuff doesn't work with it, but be strong in the Lord. And it says, above all, taking the shield of faith, or believing, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. Believing is our shield. A shield is what protects you from getting hit. You know, you have a shield. In battle, they had a shield that kept them from, getting hit by the sword. And it's believing that is our protection. And it keeps us from getting hit with all the fiery darts. And think of fiery arrows. You ever see one of those movies where, like, you've got the archers and they have, like, fiery arrows and they're shooting this, and, like, all those guys, like the Romans, were really good at doing this with their shields. They'd put those shields up and they would be, like, in such tight formation that it, like, had this, covering, this roof over all of them. Boy, there's a great picture, not just in terms of the individual shield, but when you're with a group of believers, that those shields kind of interlock, and you have that kind of greater protection, because now you're not getting it from the side that we do for one another. We can do that. We can do that. We can believe and prevent so much. And the words that we speak to one another can help encourage one another to believe for greater health by magnifying God's ability. Well, that's preventative medicine. What happens if one of those arrows does get through? What happens if your believing's not quite there and you do get sick? What happens if you haven't been the best steward and now something happens to you? You haven't been a good steward. You've been a terrible steward. You've eaten every night ice cream, popcorn, M&Ms, 3 sodas. Just telling you what I used to do. And then, it's your own fault, and you get sick. Well, then what do you do then? What do you do then? You say, well, my own damn fault, and I guess I'll just have to suffer with that. Is that what you do? No. You go to God. You go to God. Because God is so gracious. It talks about, let us come boldly, therefore, into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That's when we need help. When usually the reason why we need help in the first place is because we've missed it somewhere along the line. Either, some principle or something that we've done. That's why we need help, And God doesn't say, no, it's your own fault. Get out of here, If you have your kid and you tell your kid, okay, I don't want you jumping off of the porch, and then the kid still thinks it's a good idea, and they jump off the porch, and they come running in the house, and they're, their arms hanging off or whatever, and what do? Well, I told you not to do it in the first place, so, now that's what you get. That's what you deserve. Get out of here. I don't want to hear about it. Is that what you do? No. No, you take care of that kid, right? That's how God is, okay? We do lots of stupid things, and God is very, very forgiving and very patient and very gracious and merciful, and He has many ways to still fix us when we do something where we get hurt. So the next thing is what we call first aid, and that's not what the world calls first aid, because first aid should not be right away going and getting the bandage. Okay. Now, mind you, if you're bleeding, you might want to get a bandage. But mentally, first aid is you go to God. That's the first thing you ought to do, is you go to God. Look at Psalm 107. First aid is God should always be the first one we go to. when we do get sick, whether it's the sniffles or whether it's cancer, the first place to go is God. The first place to go is God. And we go to God, and we go to Him in prayer, and we go to His Word. In Psalm 107, verse 20, it says, He, God, sent His Word and did what?
Healed them.
And delivered them from their destructions. He sent His Word and healed them. The first thing to do is to go to God and to go to His Word and to build His Word in your mind. To actually pray and believe about this situation. And thank God. Not beg Him, not plead, but thank God for His deliverance, for His healing. Thank Him that in the name of Jesus Christ you were healed. And claim that healing. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 16. 2 Chronicles has a record of a certain king who didn't do this, and it didn't work out real well for him. Now, just to give you a little context about this king, he was no great shakes of a king anyway. Okay? This is not like, this was this wonderful king. How did this happen to him? Okay? The rest of his soul life was not prospering quite the way that it should have anyway. That being the case, in 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 12, it talks about this guy named Asa. And Asa, in the 39th year of his reign, was diseased in his feet, until his disease was exceeding great. Yet in his disease he sought not to the Lord, but to the physicians. Now, is it wrong to go to a doctor? No, it's not. It's not. And Asa's problem is not that he went to the physicians. There wasn't any sin in going to the physicians. His sin was in not going to God. Okay? Where he missed it was in not going to God. And Asa slept with his father and died in the 140th year of his reign. He didn't live much longer than that. Why? Because he never looked to God. He never turned to God. His whole life was one of having turned away from God. You see, first aid is to go to God first. Is it wrong to go to a physician? No. And, but would it be better to save that trip? Sure. Would you rather spend, I don't know how much money, doctors cost. Most of us don't because you're not paying it out of pocket, most of us, especially nowadays, huh? Whether you like it or not, you're not paying it out of pocket. But it certainly is better to just go to God. Now, how long before you go to physician? Well, that might depend on what the situation is, right? If some situations, if that arm is just kind of literally hanging by, a little bit, then you might not wait too long before you decide, okay, I went to God, quick, move on. But nonetheless, always God first. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. There's a number of different ways that we go to God. We go to Him by going to His Word. We go to Him by prayer. And another way that we can go to God is through communion. In 1 Corinthians 11, it talks about communion and the purpose of communion. We did that not that long ago. Communion is a time where you recognize what Jesus Christ did accomplish with His broken body and shed blood. And the communion service is actually supposed to be, the purpose of it is to recognize what Jesus Christ did accomplish for us. And in doing that, with the communion service, then it's one of the ways that you can claim that health. When people did the communion service without recognizing the accomplishment of Jesus Christ, though, then they did not enjoy that. And in verse 30 of chapter 11 it says, "For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. They die prematurely." The reason why people were weak and sick and dying too young was because they were not recognizing, they were not properly discerning or judging the accomplishment of Jesus Christ. Now that's not limited, that failure to judge properly what Jesus Christ accomplished, that's not just limited to when you do communion. People are weak and sick and dying too young, not because they're just not recognizing that when they're taking communion, it's because they're not recognizing that, period. You get that? It's not recognizing that. It's not fully judging it. To judge something, you have to carefully consider the evidence. So if you're sick, you could carefully consider the evidence of your symptoms, or you could carefully consider the evidence of what God said He did for you in Christ. And when you really magnify that and really ponder that and really consider it, well, then you bring about healing. Well, the second one is to then look at Mark chapter 9. If you in your own believing going to God don't get the healing, then God has another step in His health care plan for you. Second aid then is to go to someone else and have them minister healing to you, and that's available. God has given us power. He's given the gift of Holy Spirit, and that is power, and one of the specific manifestations, demonstrations of that power are gifts of healing. Where someone who's got the Spirit of God and knows what to do with it, that's been instructed, they can minister healing to another person. And that's a way that God has provided for us to enjoy overall perfect health. In Mark chapter 9, there's this wonderful record. We'll pick it up in verse 14. And when he, Jesus, came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them and the scribes questioning with them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him saluted him. And he, Jesus, asked the scribes, What question ye with them? And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. He answering him and saith, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. And they brought him unto him. And when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. And he, Jesus, asked his father, How long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, Of a child. And ofttimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. So here's this situation that this man has this son with this great need. This great need where he needs to be delivered. It's manifesting itself in the physical, but it has an underlying spiritual cause, and that's not necessarily the same cause of other diseases. But here, this person has this great need, so he comes to Jesus' disciples for help, but they don't seem like they can help him. Then Jesus Christ shows up, and he asks the man what's going on, and he asks him some detail, and he gets all this. The Father tells him all of these things, and then he goes on to say, continuing in verse 22, But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. If you can do anything, have compassion and help us. Jesus said unto him, If thou canst what? Believe. All things are possible to him that believeth. If you can believe, all things are possible. If you can believe. If you can believe. It takes believing. There's no getting around that. It takes believing. Believing is required when it comes to healing. Read the records in the Gospels about healing. You know what you're going to find in each and every one? You'll find different diseases. Some people came that were blind. Some people came that were lame. Some people came that had a son that had this, or all kinds of different diseases. There were young people, old people. There were alive people. There were dead people. There were all kinds of different people and situations. There was one thing in common. Do you know what it was? Believing. Believing. That's the one requirement. Believing. Believing. You cannot get around that. It's believing. That's the answer. Believe. Believe. This man said, if you can do anything. That doesn't sound like he was really had a lot of believing there in the situation, right? He came with the need. He came because he sort of believed, but not quite, not quite. When he's saying to Jesus Christ, if you can do anything, if you can do anything. Well, could he do anything?
Yes.
There was no question about whether Jesus Christ could do anything. So it wasn't a matter of if he could. The problem wasn't with him, and it wasn't even with the disciples who seemed like they couldn't do anything. The problem was with the Father. And Jesus Christ put that responsibility back on him. He said, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. We have to take responsibility in life. And with each and every one of these things, it comes back to individual responsibility. We have to be responsible to be stewards. We have to be responsible to God. We have to be responsible to believe. And when we go to get ministered to, we have to be responsible to believe in that situation, or quite frankly, don't go. But do go, okay? You know, the answer isn't, well, I don't really believe in it enough, so I guess I just won't do that, and I'll just go to the doctor. Well, that worked out well for Esau. Work with our heads. Work with our heads. Work with our heads to get to the place where, boy, our believing is there. Look what the man answers here in the situation. Verse 24. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Now there's an honest answer. Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. I'm here, I need to be here. Okay? I got it up to here, I need to be here. Help me get the rest of the way. That's a lot of what underlies the ministering situation. A lot of what underlies the ministering situation is it is the person ministering healing, their believing, with the believing of that other person to bring it over the top. Both have to believe. Both need to believe. Both the person ministering healing and the person receiving the healing need to believe. But boy, together, then, that can push it over the top. Help thou mine unbelief. Help thou mine unbelief. That man was still going for it. You can't quit. You can't give up. Look at John chapter 5. There are so many great records in God's Word where you see these principles. We'll look at this one in John chapter 5, verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. Verse 4, I'm not going to bother reading because it's not in any of the other critical texts. It's only in the Stephen's text. It's not in the rest of the text. It shouldn't be in there. And that makes no sense. Skip over it. It's funny, actually, in some Bibles, it'll just go from verse 3 to 5. And you're like, they left out a verse. Yeah, because it shouldn't have been there in the first place. So we'll go to verse 5. And a certain man was there at this pool of Bethesda, which had an infirmity 38 years. There's a long time, right? When Jesus saw him laying there, and knew that he had been now a long time in that case. Well, how did he know that? Did anybody tell him? No. Did he know this fella? No. It's obvious when you read the record, he didn't know him. He didn't know this guy at all. The guy didn't know him at all, knew nothing about him. Wasn't that Jesus Christ had been told all these things. He knew by revelation the situation and knew that the man could get healed by revelation. When he saw him lie and knew that he had been a long time, he said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? Will you be made whole? Do you have the will to still be made whole? You've had this for a long time now. Do you have the will to get past it? The impotent man answered him, but he didn't really. Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled and put me in the pool, but when I come, another steps down before me. Is that what Jesus answered him? Asked him? No, it had nothing to do with him. Did Jesus bother dealing with that nonsense? No. Jesus saith unto him, Rise up, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. Do you have the will to be made whole? He had had this for a long time. You know, when you have something for a long time, it's harder to still have the will to be made whole. You can get used to it. You can give up. You can be limited by your own experience. And so often in life, we are limited by our own experiences. And the more negative experiences you accumulate, if you allow it to, the more that will limit your believing. You know, when I was young, first driving a car, and I'd hear a funny noise, I wouldn't think anything of it until that noise got really loud and smoke started pouring into the car. Now you hear like every little noise. Oh my gosh, I wonder if it's that. I wonder if it's that. I wonder if it's that. You know, that's how life kind of gets you, you know. You have to fight that in life. You have to fight like every time something, you know, every time some little possible negative comes up, that your mind doesn't rush to all the other calamities that have ever occurred and what terrible experiences they were. We cannot allow ourselves to be conditioned by circumstances, including our own experience or the experiences of others. If everybody around you is dying of the, I don't know, how do you say that, bubonic plague? Did I say that right? It's not too common anymore. You know, if everybody's dying of the plague, it doesn't mean you have to die of the plague. It doesn't mean you have to. But boy, you've got to grab your mind. Do you will? Remember the woman? There's a great record to read, that whole record in Mark. I won't get it. Mark, where Jesus Christ is going to heal Jairus' daughter, the ruler of the synagogue. And while he's on his way to heal her, this woman comes along and touches the hem of his garment. She's had that disease for 12 years, over 12 years. But she didn't let that stop her. She didn't let that stop her. You cannot quit. You know what happens when you really quit, when you really give up? You die. When you really quit and you're believing, that's when you die. That's when you die. And the least common denominator, no matter what else gets us, it's that. And we get tired of the fight, and you live long enough, and you deserve a rest, I guess. But nonetheless, you know, should never be the case with people at the age of 30, 40 years old. That's for certain. And yet I know far too many that even know these truths that that's happened. That's happened. We can't let it happen. We have to fight. We have to still will. We have to will to be healed. If you haven't gotten healed one way, then get healed the next way. Keep moving down the line. If your believing wasn't there to prevent it in the first place, then go to God. And if you need help, go to another person and have them minister to you. But go there with believing. Go there with believing. Do will to be made whole. Look at Acts, turn to Acts chapter 19. You know, that record I talked about with Jesus Christ going to heal that ruler of the synagogue's daughter, Jairus. So there they are. You know, this guy comes to him and says, you know, my daughter's, she's dying. Can you come and help? And Jesus Christ said, yes. And then they're on their way to this when this happens. This woman comes in and, you know, touches the hem of his garment. And he stops and he, you know, talks to this woman, and she's kind of afraid to admit it because, like, geez, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And, you know, he says, daughter, be at peace. Your believing's made you whole. Your believing's made you whole. And then, right after that, somebody comes along and says to Jairus, it's too late. Your daughter's dead. Your daughter's dead. Don't bother the master anymore. There's a lot of things that could have went through Jairus' head, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this woman put up with this for 12 years and she had to stop him now in this situation while we're on the way for my daughter who's dying and do this, and he had to stop and do it. If we had kept going, we might have made it in time. He could have done that in his head. He could have done a lot of things in his head, but before he even has the chance to go to any of those places, you know what Jesus Christ does? He says to him, fear not, only believe. Fear not, only believe. Man, you gotta, that's gotta be so in your mind that when that upsetting, alarming news ever comes, if it does ever come, that's where it goes. You know, I'm sorry to tell you, but you have cancer. Fear not, only believe. I'm sorry to tell you, but this is going to, fear not, only believe. That has to be the way our minds are trained. That has to be the way that we think. Fear not, only believe. People say sometimes to me, why don't we see more miracles? Why don't we see more healings today? Why don't we see more of that? God hasn't changed. God hasn't changed. You know, in Israel, you know, people asked him, Jesus Christ, kind of a similar question. He said, you know, there were a lot of lepers back at the time of Naaman, but none of them were healed. You know, only Naaman. Well, what was so special about Naaman? He believed. And it took him a bit to get there, didn't it, if you know the record? Yeah. You know. And yet he gets around to it and he believes and he gets healed. Fear not, only believe. Whatever it takes, don't give up. Third aid is going to a doctor. Now, there's no verse in the Bible that I can show you where the guy went to the doctor, but what I will show you is one of a number of places where you see that God doesn't care how you get healed. He just wants you to get healed. In Acts 19, verse 11, it says, and God wrought special miracles by the hands of Paul, so that from his body were brought unto the sick handkerchiefs or aprons, and the diseases parted from them, and the evil spirits went out of them. Is there healing in handkerchiefs?
No.
You know, might be good for wiping your nose, but is there healing in aprons? No. Is there healing in the shadow of a person? No. And yet it says when Peter walked down the street, just his shadow passing over people, everybody was healed. Is there healing in the spit of a holy man? And yet when the man born blind came to Jesus Christ, he spat on the ground and stuck that little mud ball right in the guy's eye. Why? Because that's what it took for the guy to get healed. That's where his believing was at. God doesn't care what it takes. If it helps you to have mud stuck in your eye, then he'll be glad to have somebody stick mud in your eye. If getting a handkerchief or an apron will do it for you, then by all means get one. If it's a doctor, and I'm not trying to put doctors in the same category, but my point is God just wants you healed. That's what's important. Whatever it takes. But boy, don't give up. Don't quit. Don't give up in your mind. Don't stop until you have the deliverance. Bless you.